So welcome back after the break. And when a number of us were talking about and giving some advice to Homi about how this conference could be structured, it occurred to me that it would be interesting to put on a panel, if we could arrange such a thing, on the effect that the First World War had on thinking about political structures. We take for granted that the First World War created an enormous transformation in the way in which people thought about their states and their nations. But of course, that has always been the basic material of political thought, people thinking in a relatively abstract way about the political structures that they inhabited. And yet we have never, I think, properly focused on the ways in which this catastrophic event in European history transformed the ways in which people thought about their political structures afterwards. And I'd like to just read you very briefly something which seems to me to sum up the attitudes of people on the eve of the First World War, which is the afterword, or the conclusion, to the history of English political theory, 1848 to 1914, that the well-known liberal internationalist and historian of political theory, Ernest Barker, published. And I think it ranks among the most inept prophecies ever penned, because this was published in 1914, just before the guns opened. And what Barker said was this, looking back over the political theory of the previous 60, 70 years, trying to summarize what he took to be the salient features of modern political theory. A certain tendency to discredit the state is now abroad. The forces which combine to spread this tendency are very various. There is the old doctrine of natural rights, which lies behind most of the contemporary movements that advocate resistance to the authority of the state. But there is also the new doctrine of the rights of groups, which is today a still more potent cause of opposition to the state. He gives examples of that: trade unions, religious groups, and from a different point of view, the dissolution of the state at an international level. And he cites Norman Angell, who also, as we all know, in effect was an extremely inept prophet, because famously Norman Angell thought that the existence of world capitalism meant that warfare would now be impossible. And Barker concluded in 1914, we may need, and we may be moving towards, a new conception of the state, and more especially a new conception of sovereignty, which shall be broad enough to embrace these new ideas. We may have to regard every state, not only the federal state proper, but also the state which professes to be unitary, as in its nature federal. We may have to recognize that sovereignty is not single and indivisible, but multiple and multicellular. That last sentence seems to me something that could very easily be said by almost any theorist of the state and of sovereignty today. This is the way in which many people talk, particularly in Europe, but also I think around the rest of the world, about pooling sovereignty, the disappearance of the old notions of sovereignty, and so on. We live in a world where what Barker described could be said very much about our world. The guns open. No one is going to go back to this view for getting on for 100 years. And instead, this liberal internationalism, I would say, found it extremely difficult to cope with the world that it inherited after 1918. And one question which I think we should consider in the course of this conference is, what were the ideas that turned out to be most effective at helping people to rebuild the world that had been destroyed during the First War? It was not going to be the sorts of ideas that Barker has expressed. You're not going to get very far standing in the rubble of European nations in 1918 saying we need a new conception of the state as something which is multicellular and not unitary and sort of weakened in all these ways. What you want is some theory which is going to justify the construction of new kinds of effective states. And I suspect that something that we have barely touched on, though Margaret Mellon did touch on this last night, which is the Marxist tradition. One of the reasons for its strength after 1918 is that, with a number of qualifications, Marxism provided an answer to some of these questions in a way that 19th century liberalism did not. So I think there are many important changes produced by the war in, so to speak, classic political theory. And we've got three people here who are going to address some of these questions, but of course in very different and distinctive ways. And the first has come up from MIT. He's Christopher Capozzola, who's an associate professor of history at MIT, and is the author of a work on American attitudes to the First World War, Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen. So, Christopher, if you could start.
All right. I'd like to thank the Mahindra Center and also Sarah Razor, especially for the logistics, my fellow panelists, and also congratulate you all on making it here today in the weather. It's nice to be together with everyone here in Nome, Alaska this afternoon. I'm also excited that Harvard this weekend is commemorating the centennial of the First World War, and I'm going to give you a brief detour before I launch into my talk. I am very excited that Harvard has convened this conference, also to learn recently that the Harvard Club of Paris has brought out a book commemorating the men who served as volunteer ambulance drivers, a great story of global citizenship and public service that I think would very much inspire the undergraduates here today. But this is only part of Harvard's history in the First World War. And so I'm going to take a minute to just speak as both a cheeky and ungrateful guest of the university, but also a fond alumnus of Harvard College, to round out the story for a moment. We might consider Charles Warren the primary benefactor of American history at this university and the intellectual architect of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, a man who departed Washington for Harvard and history writing after resigning in protest from the Justice Department because his supervisor, Attorney General Thomas Gregory, had blocked Warren's efforts to demarcate the entire United States as a war zone. Next, we might consider Lucius Nieman, whose widow endowed the Nieman Foundation and its remarkable programs, but who remembers that in 1919, Nieman's Milwaukee Journal won the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for its, quote, strong and courageous campaign for Americanism, which is to say, for those of you who have not spent much time between the pages of that paper, 2 years of uninterrupted anti-German vitriol that set the stage for vigilantism, church burning, and mob intimidation in the Wisconsin countryside. Third, as in 2015 we delight in Harvard's newly renovated art museum, perhaps we should ask about the decision in 1917 by the Board of Overseers to shutter the, quote, Harvard Germanic Museum for nearly a decade and award an early and almost certainly unwanted retirement to its German-born curator, Kuno Franke. And finally, we might consider the case of Zechariah Chafee, professor at the law school and one of the earliest and most articulate critics of the war's violations of free speech. The publication of his report on the illegal practices of the United States Department of Justice put the brakes on the Red Scare. It also led to a kangaroo court convened at the Harvard Club to try his fitness to teach. I could go on, but I think I have made my point. Today's sessions, I hope, are only a partial commemoration of this university's history. I regret that President Faust was not here for that diatribe. My subject today is something quite different, which is the First World War and the invention of American public opinion. And I choose that word invention for a reason. The war years represented a period when public opinion in the United States and elsewhere was actively shaped, manipulated, and fabricated, invented in that sense. But the war also marked a moment when this thing, public opinion, emerged as an object of social scientific study. The First World War brought to the fore the problem of democratic theory in an age of mass communication. And it made political knowledge a crucial question, perhaps the crucial question for 20th century political theory. It also generated an entire academic discipline of American public opinion, an entire industry devoted to the quantitative investigation of the American political mind, and a political culture devoted to and distorted by an obsession with those quantitative outputs. The road to Nate Silver, I argue, begins in the summer of 1914. Let me begin with a quote from political scientist Harold Lasswell. "A word has appeared which has come to have an ominous clang in many minds: propaganda. We live among more people than ever who are puzzled, uneasy, or vexed at the unknown cunning which seems to have duped and degraded them." In his 1927 book, Propaganda Technique in the World War, Lasswell put his finger on 13 years of puzzlement and vexation. But he was hardly alone. During the war, and especially after it, Americans assigned an astonishing manipulative and manufactory power to official institutions of information. They named this thing propaganda, an old word, but a distinctly modern phenomenon. Their definitions and ours are varied and slippery, and I'm going to set them aside this afternoon. But I do want to quote here from the historian Brett Gary, who has nicely traced those definitions in his book, The Nervous Liberals, and identified what all of their definitions had in common. Propaganda, quote, "combined the aggressive passions of nationalism and revolution with machine-age scales of mass production and distribution, targeted, uprooted, dislocated, and allegedly volatile mass publics, was buttressed by the increasingly widespread perception that irrational impulses govern human behavior, and was practiced by an emerging coterie of professionalized experts who understood the commercial or political efficacy of manipulating those irrational forces for concealed purposes." Almost any definition of propaganda in the years during and after the war takes those features for granted. Now, what did Americans think that propaganda had made them do? The World War I home front witnessed some of American history's most brutal repressions of labor, of pacifism, of ethnic difference. Americans instigated notorious episodes of outright mob violence. I count more than 70 men and women killed in public incidents on the home front during the war. I could give extensive examples, but the point is that such events filled newspaper pages nearly every day. They were commonplace in every sense of that word. Now, as this was happening, and even more so after the war, critics spoke out against what Senator Hiram Johnson identified as America's, quote, "peculiar sort of mental hysteria." Before the war was even a month old, Federal Education Commissioner Philander Claxton warned Americans against, quote, "being carried away by a wave of hysteric patriotism." Norman Thomas, a socialist organizer who worked to defend conscientious objectors, spoke of, quote, "national madness." The social critic Thorstein Veblen diagnosed dementia praecox, or schizophrenia. And indeed, to our minds, many of the events of the war years do seem not merely irrational, but crazy. But I reject this interpretation, which I think trivializes the legitimate crisis of mental health and mental illness that accompanied the war, and also pardons people for actions that they took with rational minds. The violence was not a mere psychic aberration, nor a deviation from American political culture. Pervasive political violence, willingly undertaken, was politics as usual. Now, who had made Americans behave this way? Some targeted George Creel, head of the Federal Committee on Public Information, the government's official propaganda institution. Founded just days after the war, the CPI had from Wilson only a vague mandate to, quote, "promote the absolute justice of America's cause, at home and abroad, through publicity in any media." Creel always claimed that the CPI was not a propaganda organization. Building on his experience as a progressive muckraker, he insisted that the CPI, true to its name, provided information to a discerning and rational public rather than seeking to manipulate opinion or emotion. In practice, however, the CPI operated much like the propaganda and censorship agencies of the other wartime powers, although with a somewhat smaller budget. The speaking division's 4 Minutemen gathered 75,000 volunteers across the country to deliver brief speeches on war aims, food conservation, the draft, and bonds in public parks and movie theaters. More than 9 million people attended CPI public fairs and exhibitions. Its civic and educational division circulated 75 million copies of publications in a country whose population was about 120 million. In the war's aftermath, critics would attack the CPI, its techniques, and its leader, George Creel, and it came to symbolize the excesses of wartime repression. But the organization's achievements and actions reflected, I think, a broad consensus between the CPI, the American press, and much of the general public. Others, at the same time, blamed the intellectual establishment, writers and artists who joined a collective called the Vigilantes that churned out pro-war screeds. In 1927, H.L. Mencken's disciple Harley Grattan, writing in the American Mercury, reserved special blame for academia. Quote, "Bang went Princip's pistol at Sarajevo, and bang went all the professors. For 5 long years, the word objectivity was abolished from their vocabularies. They harangued Kiwanis, they wrote letters to the newspapers, they preached in churches, they invaded the movie parlors, they roared like lions." Others, in a typical American fashion, blamed the Europeans. During the war, they blamed the Germans, said to be in league with the brewing industry to buy up Midwestern newspapers, which they did, to subsidize the most articulate defenders of neutrality, which they did, to stir up trouble on the Negro question by circulating the Chicago Defender in the rural South, which they did not. After the war, the British instead came under glare. In exposés such as Campbell Stewart's Secret of Crew House from 1920, Arthur Ponsonby's Falsehood in Wartime from 1928, readers learned of British actions to cut the Germans' transatlantic cables and control the inflow of war news to North America, which they did. That British propagandists leaked the Zimmerman telegram at a crucial moment to draw the US into the war, which they did. And that the British had deliberately falsified accounts of German atrocity in civilian Belgium, which they did, although just sticking to the truth would have been atrocious enough. So the full story of the invention of American public opinion during the war combines, I think, all of these explanations and more, and requires what I call in my book a social history of political theory that looks that pays more attention than most historians or theorists have to the institutional structures of media and information, to the sites for the production and circulation of political knowledge. Not merely the press and the poster, but to clubs and churches, schools and workplaces, sermons and gossip. For all knowledge, but especially political knowledge, is socially situated and collectively produced. Now that's a point that was made nearly a century ago by Walter Lippmann. For Lippmann, who was just 29 years old when the armistice came, the war had been a thrilling and terrifying adventure. The young journalist had been one of the founders of the New Republic, long before it became a vertically integrated digital media platform, and he was a leading wartime intellectual. 2 phases of his wartime service gave him pause and inspiration. His work on the Inter-Allied Propaganda Board, a PR machine for the administration's foreign policy aims, caused him some anxiety and regret. His service on the Inquiry, a board of foreign policy experts, gave him more consolation. Let me start with the anxiety. In 1920, Lippmann wrote a very hinty letter to the editor of the Atlantic Monthly. It's clear he's looking for an assignment, noting that, quote, "I have started to write a longish article around the general idea that freedom of thought and speech present themselves in a new light and raise new problems because of the discovery that opinion can be manufactured." Now, amid the noise of wartime America, all that mob violence, Walter Lippmann heard silence. Out of fear, ambivalence, helplessness, or simple indifference, many Americans had remained silent, a stance that Lippmann knew could not be summarily categorized as either resistance or tacit consent. So in that series of essays, which the Atlantic Monthly sort of eagerly acquired and later published in 1920 as Liberty and the News, Lippmann explored the sources of that silence, introducing into American political vocabulary the concept of the manufacture of consent. The phrase is Lippmann's. Hopeful at first that objective journalistic methods could save the public from manipulation, in the next years Lippmann went further toward a confrontation with the problem of public opinion in mass society. First in his book Public Opinion from 1922, and then The Phantom Public in 1925. In Public Opinion, Lippmann rejected outright the notion of the omnicompetent citizen, a fictional character who appears in political theory with the premise that with enough information, he or she, mostly he, could make a reasoned decision about any matter of public interest. The omnicompetent citizen was, Lippmann said, an inaccurate description of reality. Rather, people trafficked in what he called the pictures in our heads. We define not at random, but according to stereotypes demanded by our culture. And it is Lippmann who first propagated on a grand scale the term stereotype. The public, he feared, can only meddle ignorantly or tyrannically with the problems of a complicated civilization. Now, a word of warning. Lippmann is often read as an anti-democratic elitist, disdainful of the common man. But it's important to read carefully and note that Lippmann did not think anyone was capable of omnicompetence, except maybe himself. But in most cases, he did not think anyone was capable of omnicompetence. I have not happened to meet anybody, from a president of the United States to a professor of political science, who came anywhere near to embodying the ideal of the sovereign and omnicompetent citizen. This Lippmann is not H.L. Mencken. This is not the disdain for the bourgeoisie of the 1920s that characterized much public discussion. But for Lippmann, the non-existence of this omnicompetent citizen was only half the problem. It also had consequences. And in The Phantom Public, he traced those implications. And this is from that work. The private citizen today has come to feel rather like a deaf spectator in the back row, who ought to keep his mind on the mystery off there, but cannot quite manage to keep awake. He knows he is somehow affected by what is going on. Rules and regulations continually, taxes annually, and wars occasionally remind him that he is being swept along by great drifts of circumstance. Yet these public affairs are in no convincing way his affairs. He lives in a world which he cannot see, does not understand, and is unable to direct. In the cold light of experience, he knows that his sovereignty is a fiction. He reigns in theory, but in fact, he does not govern. Now, if the problem was the Inter-Allied Propaganda Board, the solution was the inquiry. Boards of disinterested experts who could frame issues, speak on matters of expertise, and govern unencumbered by this ignorant public. They initiate, he writes. They administer, they settle. This theory would subject them to the least possible interference from ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. It is a theory which economizes the attention of men as members of the public and asks them to do as little as possible in matters where they can do nothing very well. The public must be put in its place, he later wrote. Now, I'm not endorsing this theory. I am merely recovering its origins and historicizing it in conjunction with Lippmann's own wartime concern for what he called the man back home from a crusade to make the world something or other it did not become. John Dewey initially endorsed the theory, but he qualified it, noting that, quote, the enlightenment of public opinion still seems to me to have priority over the enlightenment of officials and directors. Political scientist Harold Lasswell took up Lippmann's challenge on both a theoretical, practical, and social scientific level. He shared Lippmann's faith in the scientific method and sought to understand public opinion as an artifact of inquiry. Now, I won't go into as great a depth on Lasswell as on Lippmann, but we can see in the wake of the war the emergence of public opinion as a field of research in political science and other disciplines. It is worth remembering at this seminar this weekend that the World War was a moment of triumph for the social sciences, even as writers and painters, for instance, left their ways of knowing in tatters on the battlefields of France. We should also reckon with Lasswell's confrontation with the invention of public opinion in the other sense. Very quickly, in the post-war period, and certainly by the 1930s, in American culture at least, propaganda came to be understood almost exclusively as a technique for the dissemination of anti-democratic ideas. Lasswell, though, wanted to see it other ways, insisting that propaganda need not be accompanied by normative judgments. Quote, propaganda, considered as the technique of controlling attitudes by the manipulation of significant symbols, is no more moral or immoral than a pump handle. Now, he wrote that in his 1941 essay, The Garrison State, in the midst of a Second World War, when he wanted to convey to Americans that propaganda was useful and could be democratic, and urged the state to deploy national symbols to mobilize the American public and to protect American liberalism from the propaganda of fascism and communism. Lasswell had put a social scientific spin on that other central question of 20th century political theory: how does liberalism coexist with the illiberal? Together, we can see Lippmann and Lasswell inventing public opinion as an intellectual artifact, even as they grappled with the consequences of the wartime invention of public opinion itself. A century later, we live in their shadows. Those two questions, how to protect a citizen's sovereignty in an age of mass communication, and how to defend liberalism in the face of illiberalism, are matters that perplex us still today. And in our own times, of weapons of mass destruction and fictional yellow cake of 9/11 and Charlie Hebdo, it is easy to despair. But like Walter Lippmann, let me end on a not entirely despondent note. Those who accuse him of hostility to democracy or to reason are the people who don't read the last and most lyrical chapter of his book, Public Opinion. There is an inherent difficulty, Lippmann admitted at the end of his book, about using the method of reason to deal with an unreasoning world. But, and here he draws from his pragmatist teacher, William James, it is necessary to live as if goodwill would work. Lippmann saw a place for public opinion, and the one particular place he saw it was something I think would be of particular interest to this seminar on violence and nonviolence. It is the function of public opinion to check the use of force in a crisis, so that men driven to make terms may live and let live. And then in his final paragraph, what we have seen of brutality we have seen, and because it was strange, it was not conclusive. It was only Berlin, Moscow, Versailles in 1914 to 1919, not Armageddon, as we rhetorically said. The more realistically men have faced out the brutality and the hysteria, the more they have earned the right to say that it is not foolish for men to believe that because another great war took place, that intelligence, courage, and effort cannot ever contrive a good life for all men. Great as was the horror, it was not universal. There was muddle and there were miracles. There was huge lying. There were men with the will to uncover it. And if, amidst all the evils of this decade, you have not seen men and women, known moments that you would like to multiply, the Lord himself cannot help you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Extremely interesting, particularly those last remarks. I've been thinking all the way through that we must, as well as acknowledging the horror, we must acknowledge the capacity to survive. And I hope we'll come back and talk more about that. So the next speaker is Charles Mayer from Harvard, one of the, of course, the leading historians of 19th and 20th century Europe, the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History here, and author of innumerable books and articles in this area. So we're very keen to hear what Charlie has to say on this subject. So thank you, Charlie.
The title of my paper was Violence After Sorel, and part of that title is keyed to the fact that Sorel wrote his famous Reflections on Violence 6 years before World War I. I've tried to take the title of this session seriously and ask, what did the First World War contribute to political theory? I don't mean the academic study of it particularly, but the reflection and application of major concepts, what Chris has just called, I think, a social history of political theory. And obviously, the practices and discourses of violence are a major legacy of the First World War. The connection of war and violence is organic. War is organized violence. It is violence that is taken in hand by a sovereign or a community or an authority and directed. It's different from just domestic violence or criminal violence and the retail form applications of violence that are encountered every day. And the relationship is a fraught one and one we should explore. This conference is conceived as part of an ongoing study of violence and nonviolence. I've had the pleasure of participating in some of Homie's early sessions for his 2-year seminar. I myself resist the temptation to confuse or to merge violence and nonviolence. That sort of dialectical playfulness, I think, can have terrible consequences. I was originally going to trace the connections from the violence that was war to the political ideas that stressed, and I will do this, the importance and application of violence in post-war politics. The genesis of paramilitary politics, fascism, revolution by a determined minority, including one on the left, as Richard Tuck has reminded us, and the glorification of war as such. But I will return to those. I think the time, though, has come in the conference. I'm sorry I had to miss the morning session. We do still have to teach, and on Fridays, too. I think the time has come to be a bit more precise about violence, which is a term we use very promiscuously, and which we can gain by unpacking. Our first reaction may be to think of Ernst Jünger's quasi-erotic celebration of combat in the war as inner experience and many other writings. Approaching the enemy, he writes, "We approach as conquerors, armed with all the means of power. We will force open the closed door and enter into the forbidden land. We will demolish the dikes and break like a storm flood into the broad, untouched regions. Every day, new villages and cities appear to our gaze, and rich booty falls into our fist." Obviously, this is violence as an erotic thrill, the thrust of the bayonet into the enemy's belly, the blood taking over from the brain, the substitution of instinctual power for materialist values of calculation. And violence, I think, is ultimately, I mean, it overlaps with so many other concepts, is the willingness to produce physical pain. Generally, if rational, for an objective. It is what stands behind coercion. It is the ultima ratio, as many coming to think of politics. It's where you can get power and to legislate. It is Foucault's biopolitics in its most extreme version. Elaine Scarry has shown us this tremendously eloquently. Now, taking pleasure in pain, not using that infliction or threatened infliction of pain as a strategy, taking the pleasure in the pain is something else, I think. It's cruelty, it's sadism also, but unfortunately even instrumental violence can unleash cruelty and sadistic satisfaction. So this, which is clearly what was happening, I think, with Jünger. Gertrude Bäumer, a pre-1914 German feminist, we have some feminists like the Pankhurst sisters and others who really get into the war, so to speak. Gertrude Bäumer recognizes that the war had put Germany, quote, under the jurisdiction of an order other than the materialistic technical one of the 19th century, an order which did not involve production, pay, profit and loss, cost and gain, but life and death, blood and power. Blood and power is a thematization of violence. Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, who's hardly a warmonger, writes in his 4 songs in early August 1914 about the opening of the war that it replaces individual hearts with one hot iron heart. And this sort of violence, and the specter of violence, fuses hitherto disparate egos into one collective consciousness. So the experience of violence can produce an almost out-of-body trance. Wilfred Gibson, a British poet, writes, quote, a short poem, "They ask me where I've been and what I've done and seen, but what can I reply who knows it wasn't I, but someone just like me who went across the sea and with my head and hands killed men in foreign lands, though I must bear the blame because he bore my name." So violence takes over men. But wartime violence takes over a nation, too, overcomes the differentiated social gradations and legal provisions that have hitherto structured it. Quote, in Rilke's words, replaces our individual hearts with one hot iron heart. This is the violence we associate with the war. It appears in English diaries as well as German ones. It is a combination of exalted release and celebration of blood, often of death, sometimes one's own. It is the violence of the assault troops, the German stormtroopers or their English counterparts or the Italian arditi. These were the troops in the second half of the war who were trained to overcome the static nature of trench positions make war become a war of offensive once again. After 1918, they're pictured in Otto Dix. I'm sorry I didn't have time to prepare a PowerPoint, but Otto Dix's gas mask. The gas mask is a tremendous animation of these soldiers. They're depicted in his paintings very graphically. After 1918, in our classical account, that is the bequeathed account of our histories, they do not learn to fit back into civilian life. They are, quote, psychologically undemobilizable. They will turn to the Free Corps or to early fascist squadri, animated by the mentality of the trenches, what the Italians called trincheismo. They will fight post-war socialists who criticize their wartime effort. They will take over Fiume in Italy, next to Italy then, under their egomaniacal poet leader, Gabriele D'Annunzio, and soon thereafter join Mussolini's black-shirted fascists. They will gather in Munich beer halls to denounce the Jews and socialists who stabbed Germany in the back. None of that is wrong. Can I get a little water, thanks? None of that is wrong. World War I put tens of millions of men and boys, we have to remember how young they are. Looking at the choir last night, I was thinking they could all be fighting in the war and not just singing the memorials after it. It gave them weapons, gave them a license to kill, as war always done. It lets them be a different person, as in Wilfred Gibson's poem. And here arises an initial question. What does World War I add to the licensing of violence that had always been a major theme of European and American civilization and other civilizations as war? The many wars of the mid-19th century, here I would, in a sense, disagree a little with Margaret McMillan, because as I've studied these, from whether the Taiping Rebellion, the American Civil War, and the Wars of Unification, and so many others, it does seem to me that the mid-century interlude, the 19th century, is a very serious interlude of violence. The nation states created and recreated and remolded in that period are done so on the basis of war. And they had not been trivial affairs. The wars later in the colonies, like the Boer War, the Herero Uprising that the Germans put down, had unleashed strategies of concentration and genocide. The North Americans, us, and Argentines and Australians had conducted campaigns of wholesale ethnic cleansing, if not genocide, and often genocide. The Balkan Wars, just a few years before, had been scenes of horrendous campaigns. The Carnegie Foundation really gets its start in documenting war in these battles. And of course, World War I brought back the violence to Western and Central Europe, where it had been endemic in the 17th century. It had repatriated the military experience. It made it allowable. Now white Europeans could kill white Europeans. But white folk had been killed before in the terror of the French Revolution and the suppression of the Vendée, the suppression of the Sicilian Brigantaggio after Italian unification in 1860, in the execution of thousands of French communards after the suppression of the Commune in 1871. All these groups, and this goes to stereotyping, of course, all these groups had been divested of their humanity by those who prosecuted them and killed them and exiled them. They were not part of the species. Just as later in the 1970s and 1980s, the left in Guatemala, Nicaragua, Chile, Argentina, students and suspected leftists were not part of any community or even humanity for those who took up arms against them. The key to all this violence, I think, is in part, is a depressing, for me depressing, at a certain point, violence is no big deal. We set up seminars because it seems it is a historical fact. But when it's engaged in, these deaths just pile up. It rests on dehumanization of the victim, who becomes part of a category, not a person. This is easier at a distance, say at 10,000 feet, bombing a city, or in a drone site hundreds or thousands of miles away. It rests upon the more distant you can make the perpetrator, the killer, from his victim, the more this dehumanization can be accomplished. It is artillery which inflicts the most casualties and deaths in the First World War. Soldiers get buried alive, they get killed by shrapnel. It was American student volunteers who's in the ambulance corps, whose diaries I've read and written a preface for, note that machine gun bullet goes cleanly through, but the shrapnel shard is just an awful thing to deal with. Bayonets, it's the romantic side of violence, but they kill an infinitesimal number of soldiers. So this is violence at a distance, and this ascent from retail to wholesale killing could take place was well understood. The Hague Conventions of the late 19th century and early 20th had tried to circumscribe the violence that might be resorted to, and far-sighted critics did understand what might develop. H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds is a fantasy, but one of mass violence. Less a fantasy was Ivan Bloch's treatise on war, a Polish Warsaw Jewish doctor who wrote many volumes showing that the Russian Empire was ill-equipped to fight a war, one of the reasons that prompted the Tsar to ask for a disarmament conference. All these men and others envisaged mass destruction delivered in mass doses. I show a movie, I couldn't get it in time, there's a thing called The War of the Future. 3 years after Kitty Hawk, after this flimsy plane takes off over the North Carolina dunes, there's a movie made by Brits, but showed in Germany, in which you have Zeppelins coming. It's ludicrous in its amateurism, and dropping bombs, and then drone-like planes being sent up to shoot them down. The hero of this gets to marry the girl he wanted, who was hitherto refused him. But you have, it is not, every technological innovation is mobilized for war as very quickly as possible. But violence still, I think, can become too encompassing a term. Consider Sorel's Reflections on Violence, as I said, published in 1908. What does he mean by violence? Now, Sorel is no pussycat. He is not. He is a man who thinks he's a hard engineer. This profession that's professional and stands above class conflict and deals with science. And he's clearly not. He doesn't like gentleness. But he differentiates violence from simple bloodshed. Violence as bloodshed, he says, arises from utopias, fantasies of uniformity and destruction, such as motivated the Jacobins and the socialists, as he sees. Utopias, in contrast, are utopias are the elaborate schemes for rebuilding society that require uniformity and repression. In contrast, violence is the social and doctrinal vigor that keeps opposed groups on their toes. It emerges from myths, not utopias, great simplifications of life and struggle. The myth of the general strike, in his case. Violence is group combat, but it can remain in the field of doctrines. In specific, the myth of the general strike will make the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, put them both on their mettle. Sorel understands that violence requires a fundamental division from another group, what Carl Schmitt will refer to as the basis of politics between friend and foe. But it thereby unites the community of friends and presumably that of foes. And so here violence is reduced to almost a theoretical energizer, somewhat the way Marinetti, who Margaret McMillan cited yesterday, envisaged it. And bourgeois literature throughout Europe is filled with efforts to enhance collective existence by appeals to violent acts. Better a war than this terrible waiting, write the two French École Normale students under the pen name of Agathon after polling their fellow students who showed precisely the impatience that Margaret talked about yesterday. The clash of bourgeois and working class provides many images of violence before 1914. Recall Jack London's Iron Heel with the Battle for Chicago, this urban warfare he revels in. The Italian economist Maffeo Pantaleone, a disciple of Sorel, sorry, names slipped. The elitist teaching in Lausanne, Pareto, anticipates the Italian agricultural workers igniting class war in Emilia-Romagna almost gleefully in 1908 and, quote, electrocuting bourgeois women, referring to an American innovation that had recently been received attention. Misogyny is usually in style in these images. Violence can summon up physical cruelty against civilians, but this is part of an enlarged sphere. Violence is also the flip side of the collective experience. The exaltation of Germany's August days in August 1914, the feeling of community that Gertrude Bäumer and many others had cited, the Kaiser's saying, "I recognize no parties anymore, just Germans." Does Sorel's violence lead ineluctably to the bloodlust of Pantaleone? I don't know. My own reaction when learning of this terrible incident, the burning of the Jordanian pilot by ISIS in his cage, was to think, God, if I could get hold of those guys, I'd cut off their forearms and let them bleed to death. Violence is contagious. But let's consider more closely what is at stake. First, violence is seen as regenerating a community and individual. It is purifying. This is the sense in which that French of war that French writers and apologists will think of as the morality of the right. The critics who are quasi-apologists for the proto-fascist literature of the 1940s in France cite the author's search for a new morality, always. It appears on the left, Sartre's preface to Fanon, that almost celebrated or infamous evocation of killing. But violence there is a regenerative image, which doesn't mean it should be excusable, of course. Secondly, violence for war. They are not the same, but they overlap. Violence that creates the new community and the new identity that gives people their new hot iron heart. This is crucial. It dissolves petty distinctions of rank or perhaps ethnicity at home, although it can amplify them. It allegedly eliminates social class. It endows the community with a virtual, electrically charged sense of unity and shared danger. It creates an identity. It is what Schmitt thinks of when he sees the French friend-foe distinction as the foundation of politics. For Schmitt, democracy, and he always claims to be a Democrat, not a parliamentarian, not a liberal. He insists he believes in democracy when he criticizes parliamentarism as an exercise of identity building vis-a-vis a necessary opposition. Third, the violence of war, and it's not always wartime, is praised or deplored because it offers a political model that is the opposite of liberal Europe's. It condemns government by discussion. Not all such condemnation of government by discussion leads to violence or invokes violence, but violence, it seems to me, does always produce this contempt for discussion and for solving political problems. And the government by discussion is the great achievement of the 19th century, after all. Parliaments exist throughout Europe by 1908, finally in Russia and in Turkey. But government by discussion is slow, and above all, it's corrupt. Violence meant clearing away what Austrian critics would call the Schwarzbude, or talk shop, of the parliament. The supreme political act, in this view, is no longer discussion and deliberation and having deputies vote. It is obeying or commanding. The model becomes that of leaders and followers, the wartime model. This is a step up, I think, even from what Gustave Le Bon had theorized as the crowd in the 1890s. The crowd acts as a collective mass, whether in the street or in the jury room or the parliament, perhaps the lecture hall sometimes, but it is a mass. Violence, as instituted after the war, requires a leader and followers who act instinctively and not cognitively. The distinction intensifies with the rhetoric of violence between the men of action at the front who risk their lives and the men who talk endlessly behind the lines and send the young ones off to die. Eric Maria Remarque's hero returns on leave to his classroom and finds his teacher preaching an empty patriotism. Harvard's version of Mr. Chips, I'll add one more Harvard authority to your litany, is the beloved English rhetoric teacher, Charles Copeland, Copey, who lives in bachelor quarters in Hollis Hall and has never traveled abroad, and who holds Monday evening salons for undergraduates, exhorting them before 1917 to get ready for America's entry into the war or to volunteer for service abroad. And undergraduates who might question the war and what's happening are swiftly shamed into shutting up in this thing. Their letters to Copey, though, many go off, and I don't mean to despise them. Some went to ambulance work and left me the American Field Service, which first sent me to Europe. But the letters to Copey are preserved in our archives. I teach from them in my course on war, and I did have a chance to speak to Copey with Drew Faust before she gave her recent lecture in Cambridge. Competence, so we have our own exhorters. Competence sense that there is no sense of consequence to their actions behind the lines. Sassoon writes about the vaudeville audience of the music hall in London. The house is crammed, tier beyond tier they grin and cackle at the show while prancing ranks of harlots shrill the chorus, drunk with din. He's quoting the chorus, and we're sure the Kaiser loves our dear old tanks. I'd like to see a tank come down the stalls, writes, lurching to ragtime tunes or Home Sweet Home, and there'd be no more jokes in music halls to mock the riddled corpses around Bapaume. So we can see the violence can turn at home, too. The contempt for parliamentary or civilian life is extended to the capitalist economy as one of profiteering. And these critiques had all become commonplace in Europe, especially in France and Italy during the late 19th century. Then liberalism was excoriated as the regime of special interests and corruption. Now it is the regime of incompetence and indecisiveness. And fourth, and this is a consequence of the above, war changes the spatial geography of experience. The real boundaries that matter are less those between countries than between the killing zones, as John Keegan has labeled them, and the immune zones. In the killing zone, the need to be is killed or be killed. The law of violence prevails, at least episodically. The war zone is somewhat more general, as Chris cited it, is where the military law will prevail, and civilians can be shot or imprisoned or hanged by executive order, by the imperial power. The war, behind the front, though, these zones are suspended. The war experience intensifies what I would call the pervasive territorialization of communal life. This will carry over between the wars as new realms of ethnic cleansing or reshuffling of communities. What Lord Curzon called the unmixing of peoples continues even more intensely. Now, I come to a conclusion. It is tempting to think that this all adds up to the genesis of fascism. Indeed, leaders who took these attitudes into the interwar, the preoccupation with purification and regeneration, with creating a new identity, with removing government by discussion, they'll form the fascist cadres of interwar Europe. They will don uniforms. Indeed, fascists, and let us be equitable, the same can be said of some revolutionaries on the left, reverse Clausewitz's dictum. War is not politics by other means, but politics is war by other means. Politics is always mobilizing friends and foe. But then we must remember that these values were not created by World War I. They existed ages before. Granted, they were amplified. But then we must ask further, why did World War II not bequeath the same legacy? There was no Stahlhelm, no fascists of consequence. There was no effort in the West to make, there was an effort throughout Europe, or certainly in Western Europe, to make parliamentary politics work again. Why why this not the same syndrome? The answer is overdetermined, of course. The warmongers after 1945 were discredited. Germany was divided. It could not be a revanchist Germany could no longer be a threat. The excesses of Nazism discredited the doctrines. The loss of the war proved that fascism could not do what it had promised to do, and that is succeed at war. The killing zone was less separated from the immune zone. The air war brought violence home in a way that technology did not allow in the First War, and so the reproach of soldiers against civilians was less justified. World War II did not lack for identity building, ideas of regeneration, but it led back away from violence, at least in Europe. It did leave us civil wars and colonial wars. So did World War I create the modern world as we know it, or did it yield a terrible 30-year detour? I could demonstrate, in a longer lecture, that all the hopeful trends we saw at the end of the 20th century, whether the transformation of Eastern Europe, the ends of Latin American dictatorships, the dismantling of apartheid in South America, etc., that these trends were, could have been reached from before the war, by whether through technology, political, many international. We have this terrible interlude between, and whether and to what extent our history of the 20th century is some sort of monstrous blip or trend is we won't be able to resolve, I think, for many, many years. And that the war was such a detour. There are many pities of war, but this is one of the most striking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I think you too have given us a sense of the complexities of the aftermaths, which seems to me a running theme in this panel, as distinct from the panel this morning, which concentrated on, if you like, the lived experience of the wars themselves. What we are attending to, I think, is what the war did. And I think the question that Charlie has just raised right at the end is an extraordinarily important one. Was in a sense, the 20th century simply a mistake? So we will pursue that in discussion. So our next speaker, last speaker, is Sam Moyne, who recently, I'm extremely pleased to say, we've been able to attract to Harvard, to a joint chair in the law school and the history department. Before that, he was at Columbia, and I think he has, in effect, created a completely new area of study, historical study, which is the history of 20th century ideas about rights. I mean, many of us have tried to think about the history of rights for an earlier epoch, but it's Sam who has brought a kind of historical sensitivity to the study of the subject in what, for some of us, is our own time. So I'm really looking forward to what you're going to say, Sam.
Thanks very much. Unlike Charlie, I've only had time to prepare slides, not an elegant lecture. And the bitter truth is that I've never studied World War I. I don't plan to do so. And I made this point as forcefully as I could, but Richard was selectively not listening. So what I've decided to do in my parlous state is to try to rehearse a story that's, if you like, the opposite of Charlie's. It's about the regulation of violence and, in particular, warfare since World War I, or what you might call, reversing Charlie's term, the delicensing of violence, and rival strategies to pursue that end. I mainly have these slides because I'd like to start with a debate at the close of World War I. I actually don't know how prominent it was, but there was a debate about whether to try the Kaiser. We've exhumed this event in recent years to discover the pre-Nuremberg roots of the notion of individual accountability, and especially accountability for heads of state. This is the way that those who've looked at it have read the bid, failed, abortive bid, to put Wilhelm II on trial. If you like, it was the first attempt before Nuremberg to seek accountability for wrongdoing, and fair enough. There was a debate. There were some who opposed seeking such accountability. Lord Balfour, famous now for other reasons, remembered for other reasons, counsels never to let the lawyers get involved, which I can no longer say in my new position, but was worth considering then and potentially still now. But as a matter of Allied policy, he was overruled until it proved clear after Wilhelm's abdication that he would be tough or impossible to get in his Dutch refuge. And yet when we look back at the terms of the debate over whether to put the Kaiser on trial, I think there's something more interesting, not noted in the scholarship about this moment. And that is the crime that Wilhelm is said to have committed. Both Lord Balfour and those who successfully overrule him refer to it as a crime against humanity, but they mean bringing about the war itself, especially breaching his treaty obligations with Belgium and initiating the conflict. And in fact, the great student of this episode, Gary Bass, let's say inadvertently, has gathered a large amount of evidence about how frequent this usage was, recording all these examples, even though he also sticks to the undoubtedly very important point that this was an attempt to seek individual accountability prior to Nuremberg. But if we stick to that point, we fail to notice the paradox, which is that unlike us, our ancestors refer to crime against humanity not as what occurs within the war, but as the war itself. And in fact, it seems, I haven't done any research, but from Gary Bass's citations, that it was David Lloyd George who was most committed to this notion, most committed to this rhetoric, claiming that Wilhelm had committed offenses against international law through violating Belgian neutrality and against humanity, rising a rhetoric, the Kaiser must be prosecuted. The war was a hideous, abominable crime, a crime which has sent millions of the best young men of Europe to death and mutilation. And the men responsible for this outrage on the human race must not be let off because their heads were crowned when they perpetrated the deeds. I want to ask, why has this understanding not been integrated? Well, it's because of a standard narrative we tell now that we've recovered this debate about trying the Kaiser. Perhaps I'm just refocusing on a rhetorical accident that the phrase crimes against humanity referred to the war itself at this moment. In any case, the standard narrative goes something like this. Personal accountability failed at the end of World War I, but it was secured in a breakthrough at Nuremberg in 1945. Yet more heroically, the worst that occurred in World War II, civilian atrocity, not war itself, but killing the wrong people in it, like the Armenian genocide before, for which there had been no accountability, finally got properly named in the London Charter in the summer of 1945 as crimes against humanity, as an actual charge at Nuremberg. Actually, historians have looked back at the World War I era to see if there was any precedent for this usage. And one very good historian named Peter Holquist has dug out a 1915 Allied note that the Russians led the way to sending the Ottomans, and which used the phrase crimes against humanity, let's say more proleptically of its later usage at Nuremberg and beyond, to refer to atrocity in war rather than the aggression of war. Now, there's no claim that in 1945 at Nuremberg this precedent was known. And I think what we need to recall is that in public usage, it seems as if the Lloyd George uses way predominated in 1918 with crimes against humanity at that moment, meaning war itself. So there's no reason to indict my fellow historians for trying to tell the standard narrative leading to our interest in individual accountability for atrocities, except for this, the risk of a distortion effect due to the imposition of our priorities today retrospectively. The standard narrative leaves out the dominant meaning of the phrase crime against humanity in 1918, and it might neglect the central agenda of our ancestors at the close of World War I, as if they were preparing our agenda, criminalizing atrocity instead. For it is our agenda. I'm going to show you a couple of these fancy engrams, which track the salience of phrases and language. We're the ones who want to end impunity. And when we say that, since the last few years only, what we mean is impunity for atrocity crimes. And I want to ask, in my time, did we betray the legacy of World War I in shifting priorities from aggression to atrocity? So in my few minutes, let me consider a counter-narrative. I believe it will be more faithful to the evidence I've shown you and much of the evidence about thinking about the regulation of violence fairly far into the 20th century. This counter-narrative will have to do a couple of things. It will have, first of all, to retrieve the priority of a moral movement for war abolition rather than, let's say, merely criminalizing atrocity, at least first and foremost. And it will have to explain why we change focus, why our moral movements have sought different, perhaps lesser game. Since the 1918 events, we've succeeded in setting up international accountability of individuals for crimes, but not for the ones that our ancestors wanted to indict Wilhelm for committing. Instead, for atrocity crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity in the current sense of the phrase, what happened? Well, I think the counter-narrative will have an easy time of it in the 1940s. At the close of World War II, I've noted that the meaning in public of the phrase crimes against humanity suddenly changes. Yet at Nuremberg, the real Nuremberg, not the selective picture of the way we've typically memorialized it as a Holocaust trial, the huge priority was accorded to the supreme crime of aggression, with crimes of war given short shrift, and as the best historians have long insisted, the Holocaust per se given short shrift, even within the short shrift accorded war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are good and bad reasons for this, I think, but I want to focus on the best reason. It has to do, I think, in the aftermath of World War I and II with a complex causal understanding of the circumstances of horrendous violence. The argument goes like this: if you end war, you end atrocity, but the reverse is not the case. I cite a very great law professor named Herbert Wechsler on this point, reflecting on why, whether there was any good reason to prioritize aggression over atrocity as occurred at Nuremberg. And he writes, "Once the evil of war has been precipitated, nothing remains but the fragile effort to limit the cruelty by which it's conducted. Of these two challenges, who will deny that the larger offense is the unjustified initiation of a war?" So he's still on board with the rationale of those who hoped to hold Wilhelm II. The question is, are we? So when we try to restore that set of assumptions, the end of World War I and at the end of World War II, to a longer tradition, what does it look like? What's the broader historical framing it deserves? I believe we come up with something like the following. So I would begin with the challenge in the earlier 19th century to a millennially fatalistic attitude towards war as a necessary structural feature of human coexistence, a few classical utopias and prophetic writings in the Jewish tradition and Christian tradition aside. The 19th century also saw a large and popular revolt against the amoral premise of the bulk of modern political thought, which Richard has labeled the assumption of the relativity of patriotism, i.e., one man's just cause in war is another man's aggressive war, and vice versa. Right or wrong, peace movements of the 19th century rejected that premise. And I think they were proportionately more massive in that century than since, with the possible exceptions of the immediate aftermath of World War I and 1968. And they attempted to argue that we could aim at the big game of war rather than merely the conduct of hostilities once it regrettably begins. I think we shouldn't be surprised then when we look into the history of the law of war that we find rival projects. The attempt to humanize war that we associate with Francis Lieber in Yale law professor John Witt's well-known book, that Civil War hero who first codified the law of war. It turns out that Lieber hated peaceniks. He was a nationalist who thought war invigorated civilization, and the key was to keep it in the boundaries of a more cultivated masculinity, rather than take the peace movement's invitation to feminize and degrade the world. Meanwhile, pacifists of the era like Leo Tolstoy returned the favor, attacking the attempt to regulate the conduct of hostilities as a project that would humanize rather than end war, prettifying it so that its fundamental and unchanging brutality would be more tolerable to its observers. After World War I, it seems as if a more goodly number of people than in our day took Tolstoy's view, or at least they ranked the abolition of war first and foremost among their ends, hence their understanding of what the crime against humanity is. And they embarked on a very vigorous attempt to target war, or at least aggressive war, for criminalization and abolition. In the 1920s, at the height of this agitation, states had to hide their attempts, very robust in the American case, to preserve an inherent right to resort to force, even while colluding for public relations purposes in the new talk that the abolition of war was not only possible but necessary. This rhetoric was just too popular for states to proceed otherwise. As I said, I don't work on this, so I'll just, it's my penultimate step in my argument, give you a little book report from my preparations for this talk. These are the 4 books I read, and I want to suggest how they fit with my argument or not. Some of you will know Isabel Hull's terrific new book, which I believe both of the two of us have reviewed, about the fate of international law in World War I. She successfully demonstrates that its violation was a central issue, but I think mistakenly blurs the issue of initiating war in the violation of Belgian neutrality, which was a publicly denounced event, she shows, of very great magnitude. Where the rules governing the conduct of war, so far as I can tell, got very little press, their violation not as disturbing, though maybe the underlying conduct was for the publics that viewed it. So I think against Isabel Hull's own intention, she proves that the public cared very much about aggression, not so much or secondarily about atrocity, or perhaps if you take Herbert Wechsler's view that the greater includes the lesser, they thought that the one would include the other. 2 other books by William Gorman and David Mulligan help, I think, restore peace to the equation of the significance of World War I. And here largely by reminding us how profoundly people were galvanized to change world affairs, to prevent the recurrence of aggression during and especially after the war that was supposed to end all wars. Finally, the best of these books is by Mark Lewis, least known, I think. And it's about the attempt to invent international criminal law. And he shows very clearly that for those who cared about this issue prior to Nuremberg, the project was tightly focused on aggressive war as a crime. And indeed, that focus remained strong after World War II. The first attempt to create an international criminal court was going to be for the Nuremberg crime of aggression. We broke with that priority at some unspecified point later. So let me conclude by returning to my two narratives, the standard narrative and the counter narrative, and ask whether the proponents of the standard narrative can adjust their views in light of some of the evidence I've tried to present. Well, I think they can. I think they have a very powerful case, actually, but it has to proceed with a bit of self-congratulation and a bit of skepticism. And let me explain what I mean by that. It might acknowledge that there's been a shift of priority towards aggression, certainly in the field of international criminal law, but that's because, towards atrocity, but that's because aggression has been dealt with. We don't target war so much because we've already controlled it so completely. And then the skepticism comes in. There just are limits to the plausible control of the resort to force in international society. War will be eternal. We control resort to force above all through the UN Charter rules governing the matter. And since war will endure, it turns out that patriotism is relative. There will always be claims to just war as self-defense in the international order. The priority ought to fall on regulating atrocity once we've accepted a certain quantum of enduring, inevitable war. So with self-congratulation and skepticism in place, we justify our current priorities on the grounds that we must and should care about humanizing the wars that will regrettably happen anyway. Moreover, we learned sometime in the 60s and 70s, I believe, that what we ought to care most about in war is not their initiation, but that they are clean and that few civilians die. And we chose to focus very intently on making war humane. I think that does intersect this field of the history of human rights because our data tells us that we began to remember the Holocaust and care about it at just the time we began to embark on a human rights revolution, one that remembered war in a new way for the civilians who have suffered in them and tried to take a hygienic approach, not forestalling the initiation of war, but cleaning it. What might the counter-narrative say in response to this very powerful reconstruction of the standard narrative? Because I really hate self-congratulation. I don't think we should pat ourselves on the back for what we've achieved. Let me see if I can undermine my reconstructed standard narrative. I don't think we want to let it get away so easily to content ourselves in saying we've done what we can to regulate war and humanize the rest. For, of course, our time is a time of forever war. It's American war, led by this country in cooperation with states that cooperate in greater or lesser ways. In the last decade, the proponent of the second narrative fears that we haven't really focused enough on this fact. We've preferred to focus our ire, our moral movements, on the tortured body and pain, not our country's geopolitical role or the endless war it's brought to various places. And we've focused our ire on drones, apparently because they're not hygienic enough, even though they are the most hygienic weapon ever invented. And what I want to suggest is that if we want to resist the standard narrative, powerfully reconstructed, we can still worry that our priorities don't need to be the way they've been. Think back, if we're going to stick to American history, to the Vietnam era. Across the Atlantic and around the world, when aggression still remained in the driver's seat as the forefront of our concerns. Faithfully to Nuremberg, if you recall Bertrand Russell's show trial, his focus was on aggression. Before and even after the My Lai revelations, concern fell on initiation of war, and when war crimes became a focus, they were never separate from worries about the basic legitimacy of the war itself. And of course, that was also, uncoincidentally, the age of the massive return of the 19th century peace movement, whose, like our day, our forever war, has not provoked. Well, the worry then is one of a reversal in the age of human rights of one possible legacy of World War I. So I want to make clear that this second account, this counter-narrative I'm urging, it could not possibly be against cleaning up dirty wars, but wonders what happened to the more ambitious program of ending even clean wars rather than licensing them indefinitely or on the installment plan. The counter-narrative recognizes that for many of us since 9/11, our concerns about how wars are being fought may well be just barely below the surface concern about the propriety of the war itself, or even an indirect strategy chosen in the face of very powerful national ardor to continue it. Even if so, the worry is still that the strategy is self-defeating. It may be the best available critique of forever war, but it ends leaving it indefinitely reauthorized, as the newspaper is telling us in the past couple of days. World War I's more ambitious legacy then could have been shirked. And in the face of wars that have proved popular in our day, the rival project, Francis Lieber's project of helping states launder them, has prevailed. Not war, let alone the causes of war at the head of a complex causal account of violence, but atrocity at the tail of the causal chain became the worst thing we can do, or rather see others doing, and the only thing we believe we can control. And so we rest content with clean but forever war as the fruit of our choices, and no one calls that a crime against humanity. Thank you.
Very good, Sam. Thank you. If that's not a piece of work on the First World War, I'm not quite sure what is. Can I follow Martha Minno's precedent and ask the first question here, or at least put the first item on the table for discussion, which is that listening to all three of our speakers in this panel, I was struck by the thought that you might put one of the central questions that is raised in the immediate aftermath of the war, when people are trying to make sense of it. Was it a war of states, or was it a war of peoples? Is it a war of state systems, or is it a war of what you might call mobilized mass populations? And I thought it was very striking that in all three, really, including Sam's, very clearly in Christopher's and Charlie's, that's the urgent question that is being raised. Is it the case that something like violence is going to be necessary, or maybe peculiarly propitious, at least, towards the creation of a kind of identity as a people? Is it the case that if that is so, the way you have to avoid this, the repetition of this catastrophe, is in some way to get a kind of grip on popular political action, to subvert it, to control it, to do all the things that Walter Lippmann was thinking about. If it's a war of states, do you hang the Kaiser because the Kaiser is the embodiment of a state? Switch to wars of peoples? I think that may be one theme in the question of this fascinating switch in the meaning of crimes against humanity. The perpetrators of crimes against humanity in the modern natural rights, in the modern human rights discourse, and indeed modern jurisprudence of war, are very often individuals. They're not necessarily, I mean, they can be the states, but we will wrap up in the category of crimes against humanity, you know, the lesser functionaries, the concentration camp guards, and whatever. So I think there's an interesting shift there, that the immediate thought is the war is a war of states, and the appropriate people, if you're going to target people at all, are going to be exactly the people with the crowns, as Lloyd George said. There's some sort of shift there, and I suspect that may be to do with people beginning to think in various ways, that the state system itself may not quite have been the vehicle that led us to war, but something about what democratic politics itself is, it engenders these kinds of feelings. And after all, democracies, ever since they appeared, at least in a modern form in the late 18th century, had been associated with violence, the terror, the American Civil War, and so on. There were it looks as if there was some kind, in retrospect, it looks as if there was some kind of relationship there, which to some degree, the late 19th century, the sort of thoughts that I started by quoting Ernest Barker putting forward, was to some extent devised to subvert. I mean, break these entities up, and you won't have a single democratic site of power in them anymore. But I think that's perhaps the most important question of the modern political world. But does that sound plausible to you three? As a way of sort of thinking, at least I'll ask the question, is it seen as state or is it seen as people?
And can I address that in part and also comment a bit on Sam's narratives? I realize I first studied war systematically with Stanley Hoffman's course on it 50-some years ago, and then it was one of his early graders for this course. And he was he brought up the contrast you make about with Rousseau's critique of the Abbé Saint-Pierre, who had a project for eliminating war. And Rousseau said, this is impossible since it's there's no higher authority. As Hobbes told us, war is inevitable, and we have to think about their regulation. And I guess I sort of share the skepticism about eliminating war. These wars become harder to eliminate because it is the interest of states and the democratic state to identify with the people and to unleash a people, and for the people in the state to say, hey, this is our state, and so it is our war. And I'm not sure in the actual unleashing or dismantling of war we can really make this separation that you would like. I was at first listening to you thought, well, you're giving Nuremberg the bad rap, and you're giving the post-World War I effort to thought about getting at the Kaiser. You want to rehabilitate that. I mean, there are good. Actually, Nuremberg does take up genocide in a more continuous and pervasive way, I think, when you read it, than is sometimes critique. But as you rightly said, and then you said, the notion of the innovation at Nuremberg was not the war against humanity, although that's made criminal. It was the war against the crimes against peace in the London agenda, and the conspiracy to commit aggressive war. And this is throughout. I mean, Justice Jackson, this is his great preoccupation, and he has a wonderful peroration at the end where he says, well, he cites Richard III, I think. He said, if there are all these bodies lying about, somebody must have done it. But the difficulty with World War I is the war doesn't start with Belgium. That's August 1st, the war, or 4th, when Britain enters, 3rd and 4th. The war starts on July 28th, and then August 1st. I mean, Belgium, except for this British fixation, which is the thing that justifies Lloyd George's section of the cabinet voting for war and pushing it through, Belgium becomes, it's important for him because it was his political justification. But if you looked at the whole field of Europe, I don't think, there are that many people who spotlight Belgium outside the Anglo-American world, and it's immediately recognized that the causality of this war is not so simple. So I think the inhibition about the Kaiser and looking for the cause of the war resides in a very quick recognition, even that this war is there are a lot of states potentially responsible for this war, and if you start trying one, then where will that end? And so I think this is at Nuremberg, what the Germans do, and I guess by implication what the Japanese do, though that's a more complicated historical question, is the fact that the causation, the actual historical causation, is so much more simple, and it allows us. It is I agree with you. We have abandoned this notion of trying to find instigator, crowned head, or democratic government, or whatever, collective dictatorship, but it was there at Nuremberg. And again, the irony of Russian interventions on behalf of international laws. You cited Holquist. The tract of Victor Trainin, this is the man who was Vyshinsky's deputy prosecutor at the Soviet purge trials, which are travesties, of course, of justice. But he is then assigned to think about in the negotiations for Nuremberg. He writes a tract which then sort of people read, and it helped rescue the London agenda on Hitlerite aggression. And he says, we've got to punish this stuff. And people read it in the United States and they say, yes, this is, it gives a certain new injection of fervor into this thing. And then, of course, it's forgotten, and everybody says, well, how can, we worry about communist aggression, et cetera, et cetera. So the story of amnesia, or the story of diversion, I think, is a story, but I would not necessarily say it was a great way to proceed in 1918, because it wouldn't have been, and I don't think it was totally lost, that much before Nuremberg. Since then, it has clearly, I agree with your narrative and counter narratives, but it's very hard to, the entangling, the tragedy of war is one tragedy is there is a geopolitical systemic quality to it of conflicting states, and I think that no matter how many peoples are there, the plurality of authority in the globe is one of, is certainly, I would argue, is part of the knot that has to be inside.
Was there any legal process against Napoleon before he was sent into exile? I don't know anything about that, really. Was there? Sorry, was there any legal process against Napoleon before he was sent into exile?
Well, he was denounced in terms that I think, as I remember, as the equivalent of a war, what we would call a war criminal. Yeah. But the first attempt was to give him this minuscule kingdom, and then that was too dangerous, so send him far away. But he's not put on trial. It's just this is what the victors have done. He is a bad guy, and this is what we will do.
If I could go back to your question, I think the answer might come from Randolph Bourne, just to go back into this period and his distinction between the state and government in his essay on the state. Because I think, to your question of was this a war of states or peoples, I sort of come down on the side of peoples, which requires, I think, accounting for the role of civil society in all of the warring states, in all of the warring nations, however you want to frame it, to sort of mobilize their populations, but also to govern them, right? And so I think it requires sort of broad ways of thinking about governance, and also broader ways of thinking about violence than Charlie has put forward. I would go for the more capacious definition that would situate generals and presidents next to landlords, bosses, husbands, and others.
I think I can get away with treating Richard's question as the comment that it was. It sounded right to me. In response to Charlie, I've tried to construct a view that Nuremberg, by giving aggression priority, was much more faithful to the close of World War I than we've been. As I tried to imply, and I hope powerfully reconstructing the standard way of thinking about this, which is the way you've just rehearsed, is that it's credible, and there's no prospect to war abolition. So in the first place, all I would want to make is a small point about our task as historians to recover the opinions of people in the past, even should we feel that they were mistaken. And it seems to me that by far the most evidence we possess, even inadvertent evidence in the treatments of the end of World War I and in the best histories of Nuremberg, suggests that they had not given in to our skepticism, as well-founded as it may be.
Very good. So if people could come forward to the... sorry, he's got a... And if you could identify yourselves, not that you need much identification. Jay. Sorry.
Jay Winter. Two very brief questions. The first is, had you, Sam, been an historian of the First World War, you would have read the really rich literature, Margaret's contributed to it, said that nobody can sustain an argument that the Kaiser of Germany was solely responsible for the war anymore. So it was a lost cause. The historical analyses of many different colorations say, if you were a lawyer, don't take this case, because it would have resulted in either an acquittal, which would have been worse, or some kind of complex reconstruction. So that's the first thing, that scholarship, I think, has made the, as it were, the case for finding the perpetrators almost, in this case, in the First World War, almost impossible. The Second World War is totally different. The second point is, would anyone on the panel comment on the need to accept the fact that war has mutated in the 20th century, and you're actually using one term to describe very different institutions? I think what ISIS is doing now can be called war, but only by recognizing that what the panel is discussing is something else, and that maybe the mutation of war into a transnational, subnational, higher than national, whatever Al-Qaeda is, struggle requires us to stop trying to move from 1918 to the present, because it is comparing very, if you will, Charlie, very different frameworks, indeed legal frameworks, but also existential frameworks as to what war happens to be.
I think both of your points are incredibly powerful, Jay. Of course, we have to recognize that historians are people too, subject to trends and subject to the impress of their own moment. It may be the case that the current orthodoxy diffuses responsibility away from the Kaiser, and Christopher Clark is very popular in German bookshops. But this wasn't always the case, and there are holdouts like Isabel Hull, who, much more than me, is an expert on the subject. And I think because she's so angry at the Germans, goes way too far in trying to make international law the central issue in the war. Your other point is, I think, deep, and it has to do with the fact that what we're trying to sanitize with our hygienic approach is no longer usually interstate war, except possibly when it comes to American and Israeli war as the marquee cases, because we're most concerned, and we've both been most successful in getting jurisdiction over African war, which much more rarely crosses borders. Now, ISIL is, that's not something that's, the Security Council has not taken that up to refer it to the International Criminal Court, but as you say, the evil of insurgent forces is not something that World War I may help us think very carefully about.
I think Thomas was first, and then Homie again.
No, it's okay. Why don't we get another question or two on the table, and then we can...
Tom Weber. First, a quick question for Sam Moyne. I find your counter narrative very persuasive, but that of course begs the question what we make of the Leipzig war trials of 1921, which, if I'm not mistaken, were very much precisely about atrocity rather than aggression. So how do we explain that? Maybe just one brief comment, if I may. I'm wondering whether for the last few hours we have been trying to tell a too linear story about violence, and I think we run the risk here of telling a story of violence just in linear fashion leads to more violence and leads to this 30 years war, and sometimes easily forget that the First World War was a conflict both of a rise of violence but also of a containment, periodic containment of violence. Even in pre-1917 Russia, all these cases where British soldiers at the end of the war cross into the Rhineland and say before they cross the border, we're going to kill them all, and then they're really surprised about how similar they are. They get on perfectly well. And why this may matter for this particular session, I think, also is because that backs the question about the extent to which this is about war cultures or about the breakdown of political order and about the kind of questions people were asking in terms of political theory and maybe constitutional theory in the aftermath of the First World War. And it seems to me that people were far more thinking about just what kind of constitutional setup can you set up in order to prevent this rather than about war cultures, as evident, for instance, in the kind of disagreement between, let's say, a Wilsonian order and the kind of ideas like Thomas Marisek had in terms of a constitutional monarchy that may more follow a mold of political theories of British liberalism and democracy rather than a post-war order based on the theories of 1776 and 1789.
Can I?
That's your question.
Well, no, it's, I guess, look, I think we were talking about, or I certainly was, the cultural aspects of war. There are, World War I is an awful war, but 9 out of 10 of the casualties or deaths of World War I, leaving aside disease and some of the stuff in Eastern Europe, are military casualties, whereas 50% of the how many deaths in World War II? 50 million are civilian casualties. So World War I is still, we see it as a transition, perhaps improperly. And I was trying to think of the unleashing of justifications of violence and what the war experience, what the military experience meant. It was carried over then into this, just a new issue came yesterday for me, the Journal of Contemporary History, which is all about the wars after the war and the violence that's unleashed in Eastern Europe. I'm not but I think we've confused so many issues, not all of us. I mean, I think our society in many ways, in our political discourse, the issue, we don't know who initiates a war. We always have a counter-narrative to who initiates a war, which justifies entering a war on the other side. If you look at the origins of the Vietnam conflict and who was responsible for upsetting the Paris peace negotiations of 1954 that then lead into the escalation in South Vietnam and all. War crimes, we don't know. I mean, look, if I believed in, am I ready to send Secretary of State Kissinger to The Hague for the carpet bombings of 1973? I think in some way, I agree with William Shawcross. They're an abomination in many ways, but I just couldn't, it would be very hard for me to vote for that. And that's why we have to recognize the difficulties. The drone issue, it seems to me, is a different issue. I'm sorry, I wander from your question, Thomas, but it unleashes other questions. The drone issue is one of, do we assassinate political leaders, I think. And that's another big issue. Should we be able to assassinate political leaders? And yes, it's a clean weapon, although usually the ratio of people who happen to be in the car and the surroundings for this particular sanitized strike is at least equal to the one person we're trying to get rid of. assassination. The drone issue also raises the issue of, for the first time, people seem to be able to wage war with invulnerability. So don't we have this residual sense that there should be some fairness in this? When we put men in uniform, we say not only you can kill other men, but you can be expected to be shot at. You can be killed. We understand that. So I think modern war is an effort. That's why I think of these lines being drawn. I'm somewhat fixated by boundaries these days because I write on this stuff. But, you know, what is the boundary between the permissible and the impermissible? We set aside who can we send into combat, who can we make vulnerable, and these boundaries are never kept. They're always trespassed, and so it's a terrible situation. And the more the notion of the state, you're quite right. The Leipzig trials were a farce. They were a compromised settlement. The Germans were not prepared to say we did these atrocities, and it's one reason why Nuremberg was decided on, because you could not trust the Germans or the Japanese to deal with their own leadership, and any more than you can trust the Americans to put. I think the Iraq War of 2003-4 amounts to an aggressive criminal war, but I'm obviously not going to be very, very comfortable sitting on a court with George Bush and others in the dock.
Very good. So, Homi, sorry, Sam.
I just want to say one narrow thing, because he did ask me a very narrow question. I just want to make clear that anyone who, like me, just wants to flirt a bit with the counter-narrative isn't in the least committed to denying that people cared about atrocities in the past. It's really a matter of priorities, and my sense is that the powerful version of the counter-narrative retrieves a sense of causal complexity, which makes war the causal context in which atrocities take place. And I actually think, though, Jay's rightly fingered my ignorance of his field, when we come to something I know a bit more about after World War II, the thinking is quite broad in this respect. So the question is, at Nuremberg, and really in the totality of the aftermath of World War II, is when in the chronological causal chain do we want to intervene? Is it the summer of 1941 that things went wrong because, that's when the Holocaust begins? Or is it the war itself? Or is it 1933? Or is it 1929? Wouldn't it be best to intervene in social policy as far back in the causal chain as we did? If we believe that depression leads to war, leads to atrocity, we actually will start to think very broadly. And I think this affected how our ancestors after World War II thought about things like corporations, corporate regulation at Nuremberg and elsewhere. And our agendas, in contrast, are extremely narrow. They're at the causal end of the chain. And I think that's really what the counter-narrative wants to reverse.
Very interesting. So Homi next, and then you, I think. So Homi.
I just wanted to take up this question of transmutations. And I think Sam has just talked about the various transmutations within a certain kind of narrative of the war that we know, even saying that within that context, there are these transmutations that then raise various questions of should we have intervened at this point or that point. So we've got to recognize that even in a more traditional notion of war, there are these transmutations all the time, and each moment is a moment to call forth a certain sense of responsibility and intervention. So I just wanted to say that in a more traditional narrative is as interesting as what Jay has now pointed out. And I wanted to, my question was about transmutations and the change in the notion of territoriality, particularly now, where, for instance, ISIS or ISIL, the idea there about what the Ummah is, either what is the site of ethno-religious legitimate intervention, is very different. The Ummah is where any community of believers happens to be. And you can then create a notion of justification on that basis. There is no question of the face-to-face of warring nationalities at all. Then, of course, there is the camouflage of terror and of the camouflage of terrorism and how that works, and this whole idea of war as the pursuit of terrorist leaders and groups. So we're really now talking about targeting groups and not many nations even take responsibility for these groups. And they have an amoeba-like structure. So in a way, I'm interested in jurisdiction, territoriality, the transmutation of territoriality, its changes, its shifts, the question of responsibility, and then both in the technological sense, but also in the territorial sense, the question of virtuality, of the virtual, and how we intervene. So it seems to me the landscape is extraordinarily, the moral landscape is as complex as the political landscape. And I just wanted to make that comment to see if it played with any of the panels, if you think it's of any importance across the panel.
Could I say something about that, Hemi? I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that it's another of these areas where, and this is going back to the point that Charlie made, that it looks as if the 20th century was this sort of detour, because we found ourselves back in a world, I mean, again, the world that Barker is describing in 1914 precisely is a world in which territoriality has kind of broken down in various ways. He says, we've got these interest groups, got these religious groups, but they're defined by personal loyalty and not by, or personal identity and not by territory. And we've got sort of breaking down of the old state system internationally as well, or at least so they believe. And that's going to have both, so to speak, a pacific and a violent side to it. I mean, the pacific side is going to be something like the EU or whatever. The violent side is going to be something like ISIL. It was Al-Qaeda. Lots of people, as you remember, said after 9/11, you know, this is globalized. This is terror for the globalized age, and war for the globalized age, where the thing is sort of distributed. And as I understand it, Al-Qaeda literally means just a database, really. I mean, it's just a list of people. So, so I suspect that, you know, again, that this is really to ask the question, was the 20th century international and state system that I think is brought into being in order to rebuild these destroyed societies, is that a sort of temporary thing, or was it the creation of a world that we still live in? It looks as if it was a temporary thing. But Charlie, you want to say something about that?
These are big questions. I mean, you know, the Ummah, or I know nothing really about Islam, and that's my shame, not but you know, Islam has been a system which has claimed a community of believers, and if you look at when it was founded, it had the same notion of spread and claims that that some of its members have. But I think, you know, let's forget, ISIS wants to create a state. I mean, that's what they said. We've set up this state. And I imagine that if the rest of the international community said, okay, well, we're giving you a bit of northern Lebanon, a bit of Syria, a bit of this, a bit of that, they would, some of their zeal might moderate for a while, and then they might like bigger boundaries. But I mean, it is both at the same time, homie. It's a demand to be in the state order, and a demand saying there's a fundamental difference of legitimacy that we have to operate on, and that ambiguity exists. I think the European state order could coped with Ernest Barker. I mean, we do, you know, neo-corporatism, whatever you call it. In many ways, the morsalization of states existed, but I do think we still live with the legacy of, you know, we stylize it as 1648, where it said, you know, that states exist. They have to respect certain things, that sovereignty exists, that religion does not trump sovereignty in Westphalia, although religious guarantees are provided. And I think we don't quite know how to deal with that, but I'm not sure that the world wars are something that really flow from that problem with how internal states are internally constructed.
Austria-Hungary? I mean,
well, so it ended up in smaller states. I mean, it was always the Hungarians were never making a claim about Magyardom all over the world. They're saying, hey, we have this structure, and so do the Serbs and everybody else. I mean, the real issue that challenges the Austro-Hungarian state is the question of Jews. They're not a nationality in a conventional state, but they're there and very important. This is, there are all these sorts of questions. I think, I don't know, I guess you know, maybe one of the sins of us historians is that we live in the eras we study and get captured by their conceptualizations.
We have time for one last question. I think you wanted to. Was you in the...
No,
okay.
Jennifer Leaning.
Okay,
I'd like to hear what she has to say.
Jennifer Leaning from the School of Public Health. I would just like to make the observation that has started to be made by the floor and by the panel, that the wars we are dealing with now are in many essentials very different from the two wars that are being juxtaposed. And even, I would submit, from the international order that came out of World War II, both the Human Rights Order and the International Humanitarian Law Order. Recall the 1949 Geneva Convention was the first law of war that talked about civilians. So the point you were making, Sam, you know this well, but the point you were making, that prior to this, the international criminal law, or the law of war, was devoted towards sanitizing war, which I might not use that word, but that's okay. Starting with 1949, there was a horror of war that was built into the Fourth Geneva Convention, and then the subsequent protocols. But the fundamental point about these current wars also links to this issue of whether you can control violence in war, which is that there is a recourse in all of these documents to a stable state authority, and increasingly over the 20th century, an international authority. And in the current period now, those authorities and the international security and humanitarian architecture are breaking down, really breaking down. And there is now, in the last 15, 20 years, a big civil society and UN-led Swiss, Norwegian, Danish movement to actually stop wars altogether. Because we now see that once these wars start, we're talking about the long wars of the big wars. But once these wars start, they never stop. They really don't stop. But it's, Sam, it's a forever war that is markedly different from the established industrialized state-based wars of World War I and World War II. So I would just say that we are, this notion of aggression or mass atrocity is merging now in the current discourse because the wars are nothing but atrocities.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah, I'll make maybe one point, except first of all to say thank you. Just to say, maybe to bring it back to World War I, that I think in some ways maybe the point of this workshop is not only to trace through lines and connections, but actually to watch the people of the World War I era grapple with a breakdown much like the one that you're describing. So rather than trying to sort of, you know, see, can we save their institutions, must we abandon their institutions, it's just to sort of watch them struggle in ways that we are struggling now and ask of ourselves, what are they missing? What are, you know, what are we missing? What are our assumptions? What are our faults in the ways that we so easily do with 100 years of hindsight?
Very good, thank you. Well, thank you very much, all three of the speakers, and I think we'd like to congratulate you all on very interesting papers that do remind us that this, as you just said, Christopher, is intended to direct our attention to the current problems of violence as much as to violence in the past. Thank you.
If any question why we died, tell them because our fathers lied.
I had just got into bed on a May morning and was drifting into sleep when the cable came to say that Jeffrey was dead. When I had read it, I got up and went down to the shore in my dressing gown and pajamas. All day I sat on the rocks by the sea with the cable in my hand. I hardly noticed how the beautiful morning, golden and calm as an August in Devon, turned slowly into gorgeous afternoon. For hours, I remained in that state of suspended, physical animation when neither heat nor cold, pain nor fatigue, hunger nor thirst appear to have any power over the body, but the mind seems exceptionally logical and clear. My emotions, however, insofar as they existed, were not logical at all, for they led me to a conviction that Jeffrey was somewhere with me on the rocks. I even felt that if I turned my head quickly, I might see him standing behind me, with his deep-set gray-blue eyes, his finely chiseled lips, and the thick light brown hair that waved a little over his high, candid forehead.
Whereas the Congress of the United States, by a concurrent resolution adopted on the 4th day of March last, authorized the Secretary of War to cause to be brought to the United States the body of an American who was a member of the American Expeditionary Forces in Europe, who lost his life during the World War, and whose identity has not been established, for burial at the Memorial Amphitheater of the National Cemetery at Arlington, Virginia.
In the tar paper morgue at Chalon-sur-Marne, in the reek of chloride of lime and the dead, they picked out the pine box that held all that was left of Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo. Plenty other pine boxes stacked up there containing what they'd scraped up of Richard Roe and another person or persons unknown. Only one can go. How did they pick John Doe? Make sure he ain't a dinge, boys. Make sure he ain't a guinea or a kike. How can you tell a guy's 100% when all you've got's a gunny sack full of bones, bronze buttons stamped with the screaming eagle, and a pair of roll putties, and the gagging chloride, and the pukey dirt stench of the year-old dead?
We bury Nuri. It was God's will that I would say the opening verse of the Quran over him. Who will be next? I again find it very difficult to control myself. Hot tears stream down my cheeks. One day this will all come to an end, as all things do. I turn away from my grave and walk away.
White and colored soldiers are returning covered with glory and praise and honor, bedecked with the quad gear and other insignia for bravery. The public is astir with interest in decorating stores, hanging flags, preparing chicken and turkey dinners in appreciation of the heroic deeds of valor and sacrifice of our boys to make Europe safe for democracy. But about what are our boys thinking? Will they be Jim Crowed in the South? Will they be given the vote on the dispensation of taxes which they pay? Will they be lynched and burned for speaking correct English? When you condemned lynching during the war, you were dubbed pro-German and jailed. But now that the war is over, if you inquire whether the government is going to be patriotic to the soldiers, as the soldiers have been patriotic to it, the hands of the lip service patriots, profiteer, and parasites are thrown up in holy horror, and speculations as to the sanity of the inquirer are immediately made.
Now we can say of those who died unsung, unwept for, torn, but thank God they were not blind or mad. They've perished strong and young, missing the misery we elders find in missing them. With such a platitude we try to cheer ourselves, and for each life laid down for us, with duty well imbued, with song on lip in splendid soldier strife, for sailors too who willingly were sunk, will shout, hooray, and get a little drunk.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and toward our distant rest began to trudge.
Men marched to sleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind.
Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone was still yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning.
In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning.
If in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin, if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of bile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory that old lie. Dolce et decorum est pro patria more.